we landed on the moon on the 4th day, and on the 7th day we left.
Charles Duke was the voice of Apollo 11. Millions heard him guide Neil Armstrong to the surface, but what they didn't hear was his heart racing past 150 beats per minute, or that his wife was battling suicidal thoughts back in Houston. Duke achieved the impossible. He walked on the moon, but when he came back, his marriage was collapsing. His life felt empty, and the thing that saved him had nothing to do with space. At 90, he's revealing what NASA never wanted you to know about life after the moon. Charles Moss. Duke Jr. came into the world on October 3, 1935, in Charlotte, North Carolina, right in the middle of the Great Depression. His father worked as an insurance salesman. His mother had a job as a buyer at a department store. They were not poor, but times were tough. Charles wasn't alone. He had a twin brother, Bill, born just 6 minutes after him. That tiny gap built a bond between them that never broke. Their family had deep roots in American history, even tracing back to a Revolutionary War officer, which meant patriotism was baked into them from the start. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Charles was just 6. His father didn't hesitate. He signed up for the Navy, and suddenly, their peaceful life was filled with moves and uncertainty. That chaos shaped Charles's flexible nature and strong spirit. When his father was stationed in California in 1942, something sparked inside Charles. It wasn't just the uniform or the pride, it was the planes. By 1943, his dad was shipped off to the Pacific, and Charles, along with Bill, went to live with their grandmother in South Carolina. There, they spent hours building tiny model planes with their hands. In 1944, their dad came back and was posted to Daytona Beach. Charles was 9 then, and every day he saw real military jets roar over the horizon. That was it. The spark became a dream. After the war ended, they moved again, this time to Lancaster. Charles's dad went back to insurance, and his mom opened a dress shop. Then, in 1949, their little sister Betsy was born, and after all the wartime changes, their family finally felt whole. Charles was different from most kids. At just 11 years old, he became one of the youngest Eagle Scouts in South Carolina. He was tough, driven, and focused. Bill, his twin, had a heart defect and couldn't keep up physically. That made Charles feel guilty, but it also made him push himself harder. Through scouting, he learned things that would stick with him forever: discipline, responsibility, leadership. He loved camping in the woods and figuring out how to survive with just a compass and a map. A local congressman named James P. Richards noticed him and would later help open the door that changed Charles's life. In high school, Charles wasn't always the perfect student. He had a rebellious streak. But then, out of nowhere, he started acing physics exams. His dad saw something in him, something rare, so they made a big decision. Charles would finish high school at a military prep school in Florida. At Admiral Farragut Academy, everything changed. The boy who once broke rules became a leader. He was up at 5:30 every morning, marched in formation, studied hard, and graduated at the top of his class. By 1953, his name was in the local paper. He had earned a spot at the U.S. Naval Academy. He was just 17. But 4 years later, right before graduating from the academy, a doctor told him something that crushed him. He had a small eye problem and astigmatism that meant he couldn't be a Navy pilot. That had been his dream. Now, it was gone. There were no second chances in the Navy. He was devastated. Then came a lifeline. The newly formed U.S. Air Force had different rules. They didn't mind the eye defect, so Charles signed up. The switch wasn't easy. On a Navy cruise to Europe, he got violently seasick and realized he wasn't meant for ships. But when he climbed into an N-3N seaplane for a short training flight, the feeling of flying reignited something deep inside. He graduated in 1957 and became a second lieutenant in the Air Force. His flight journey had finally begun. At Spence Air Force Base in Georgia, Charles started primary flight training. It was tough. He flew small propeller planes, and during a solo night flight, his engine failed. He had to land in a cotton field in total darkness. It could have killed him, but he survived and kept going. He moved on to jet training at Webb Air Force Base and graduated near the top of his class. His instructors saw his potential. They gave him his choice of assignments, and he kept rising. In 1958, he trained on the F-86 Sabre, a sleek, fast fighter made to stop Soviet bombers. The training was brutal. He pulled 9 Gs in combat simulations. So many pilots passed out or hurt their necks. But Charles stayed sharp. He was built for this. From 1958 to 1961, he was stationed in West Germany with the 526th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. The Cold War was at its peak, and the base never slept. At any moment, Soviet bombers could cross the line, and Charles had to be ready. He kept his flight suit on even when sleeping. He scrambled to his jet hundreds of times, including 23 real intercepts of Soviet aircraft. One day in 1961, during a routine patrol, his plane's radar signal vanished. NATO and Soviet forces both thought he was an unknown threat. Soviet jets were scrambled and missiles locked onto him. He had just seconds to fix the transponder and show he wasn't the enemy. He pulled it off. Barely. That near-war moment was erased from headlines, but stayed burned in his memory forever. Then, in 1964, he entered a program most pilots only dreamed about, Edwards Air Force Base, where the best of the best trained. The school was run by Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier. Charles trained in F-104 starfighters, flying to nearly 90,000 feet, touching the edge of space. These weren't just flights, they were tests of the human body. With wires hooked to his chest, every reaction was tracked. He tied for second place in his class. After graduating in 1965, he stayed at Edwards as an instructor. He taught flight systems and flew all the cutting-edge jets of the time. By then, he had logged more than 4,100 flight hours, 3,600 of those in jets. Everything he had done so far, the near crashes, the night landings, the Cold War scrambles, the 9G dogfights, the teaching, the survival drills, it all led to one moment. In 1966, Charles saw an article in the LA Times about NASA needing a new group of astronauts. He applied. Selected on April 19th as part of NASA's 19th astronaut group, he was one of 19 men chosen to join a team that now had 53 astronauts. But getting there meant surviving something close to torture. At Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio, the centrifuge tests pushed him past 15 Gs. He blacked out more than once. Some vomited for hours, vision blurred, balance gone. It wasn't just physical either. He went through mind-bending Rorschach tests, long EEG sessions, and treadmills designed to break even the toughest. His friends from Edwards, Joe Engel, and Bill Pogue endured the same. It was NASA's way of simulating what it felt like to ride a Saturn V or escape a launch gone wrong. Up to 20 Gs in a real disaster, you had to be ready. And that was just the beginning. In 1967, Duke almost died in the air. The Lunar Landing Research Vehicle was supposed to mimic landing on the moon, but its controls were unstable. On his second flight, it lost control at 500 feet. Crosswinds gusted above 25 knots. Fuel ran out in the attitude thrusters. With only 4 seconds left, he ejected. The LLRV exploded in a fireball. He landed hard, lucky to walk away. Neil Armstrong had the same near-death moment a year later. That was enough for NASA. The LLRVs were grounded. It turned out they were never safe to begin with. That same year, Duke got pulled into something quieter, but just as critical. The Apollo Applications program needed someone to check the Skylab hardware. Duke, with his test pilot eye, found a flaw in the heat shield. If it failed, the space station would be roasted in orbit. Inside could reach over 250 degrees Fahrenheit. His report pushed for stronger thermal blankets, better shield attachments. Later, in 1973, Skylab flew without a hitch for 171 days across 3 missions. That wouldn't have happened without Duke. By October 1968, Duke was part of the support team for Apollo 7. Watching Earth orbital data, he caught strange readings in Fuel Cell 2. Hydrogen flow rates were off. Pressure spiked 15% above normal. He realized the electrolyte membrane was breaking down. That meant power failure. He flagged it. New rules followed. Redundancy checks, abort triggers, fallback cabin pressure protocols. They saved Apollo 13 years later when multiple fuel cells failed. But even before Apollo 7, Duke carried a secret. A spinal injury from a violent ejection seat test in 1962 had left fractures in his lower back. He never reported it. During astronaut exams in 1966, he kept quiet. But by 1967, the pain forced him into spinal fusion surgery, metal rods, bone grafts. He timed it during a scheduled break and was back in training within weeks. NASA never knew. It could have ended his career. Worse, it could have put his crew at risk. But astronauts weren't letting go of their dreams that easily. When Apollo 11 landed, Duke was Capcom, July 20th, 1969. The Eagle was descending, and suddenly, a 1202 alarm blinked. Duke panicked inside. They'd never trained for that. Abort seemed like the only option, but a 26-year-old guidance officer, Steve Bales, called go. Duke repeated it. He barely breathed as the alarms kept coming, 5 of them. The rendezvous radar had flooded the computer with junk data. Each reboot risked wiping navigation mid-landing. Still, Duke held his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. At home in Houston, Duke's wife, Dorothy, watched with their sons. She didn't know how little he was sleeping. He feared losing contact during landing. What if he couldn't call for an abort? She had tried to bridge the emotional gap, took geology classes just to relate. But Duke was distant. Dorothy later admitted to suicidal thoughts during this time. He was NASA's voice to the moon, but to his family, he was slipping away. Things got worse. Just before landing, fuel gauges clashed. One said almost empty. Another said 20% left. A 15-second error. Life or death. Duke called 60 seconds, then 30 seconds as silence fell across mission control. His heart raced past 150 BPM. Armstrong was dodging boulders. When they landed, they had just 45 seconds of fuel left, but Duke's voice never cracked. Until, just after touchdown, when he responded, "Roger. Tranquility. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." It wasn't scripted. It broke protocol. It became history. Later, he admitted Armstrong was exhausted after the landing. The rough descent had taken everything out of him. Privately, Armstrong doubted the ascent engine would fire. It had never been tested under those conditions. Duke kept that to himself. In mission control, he encouraged what he called silent prayers. Lucky charms, crossed fingers, anything to keep spirits up. Everyone knew the risk. They'd landed 4 miles off target, almost in a crater. One wrong twitch, and the gear would have snapped. Duke had nightmares for months. Dreams of lost signals, silent radios, astronauts stranded on the moon. He wasn't even on Apollo 13, but still shaped its outcome. As backup lunar module pilot, Duke had accidentally given the crew German measles. Ken Mattingly got pulled, replaced by Jack Swigert. After the oxygen tank explosion, Duke spent 35 straight hours in mission control helping save them. He helped simulate the damage, rework cryogenic systems, map out the return sequence. Ironically, Mattingly, scratched from the crew, helped power up the crippled ship for re-entry. It all tied back to Duke. For Apollo 16, he trained harder than ever. Over 1,000 hours in simulators, 200 of those in the CMS alone. Some days stretched to 12 hours. Once, a fire scare halted everything. A propellant line burst during vacuum testing. It forced a redesign. In spacesuits, Duke logged 350 hours. Commander John Young called it vital. They slept little, just 6 hours a night on average. His geology training pushed him into freezing Icelandic winters, 20 below zero. He wore suit mock-ups for 8 hours straight. In one blizzard, a rock slide buried their gear. They called an EVA abort. In Canada, he spent 3 days inside a 97-kilometer-wide crater, 1.8 billion years old. Everything they did mimicked lunar conditions. Communications would drop. Tools failed. They had to keep working, but his marriage cracked again. The Apollo 16 training consumed him. Dorothy felt like a widow. The emotional gap widened. By late 1971, she threatened to leave. Counseling started. NASA stepped in. They adjusted his schedule. Family time became mandatory. It was the only way to save both the mission and the marriage. Then pneumonia hit, December 1971 in Hawaii. Duke couldn't even sit up by New Year's. He had pneumonia in both lungs. Emergency hospitalization. Doctors said he might lose lung capacity. Just months before launch, blood tests showed infection risk. He hid it, took antibiotics in secret. If NASA had known, he'd be grounded. Turned out it was stress, not infection, but no one knew until later. The launch of Apollo 16 looked flawless to anyone watching from Earth. At exactly 12:54 p.m. Eastern on April 16, 1972, the Saturn V thundered off the pad, a powerful symbol of precision. But behind the scenes, within minutes of reaching orbit, the situation was unraveling fast. The SIVB stage, the third stage of the rocket, suffered a serious helium regulator failure in its number 2 attitude control module. It began venting helium uncontrollably, draining the pressurized gas that was vital for orientation. At the same time, the number 1 module started leaking too. It was a double blow. To make matters worse, The instrument unit that sat between the SVB and the spacecraft adapter began losing gaseous nitrogen used to control temperatures. As the spacecraft prepared for the burn to leave Earth orbit and head toward the moon, the SIVB began to shake violently. The burn lasted 5 minutes and 24 seconds, and the vibrations didn't stop. They got worse. Mission Control debated whether to shut the engine down early. Duke, Young, and Mattingly had to be ready to take manual control using their spacecraft's own thrusters, something never intended during this phase. What began as routine quickly tilted toward disaster. That was just the beginning. 3 days later, on April 19th, the crew entered lunar orbit. Then came the worst scare yet. While testing the service propulsion system, Mattingly noticed something was off. The engine gimbal, used to steer the big SPS engine, was shaking violently. It felt like the command module was running over railroad tracks. The secondary motors, meant to act as a backup, were also twitching uncontrollably. That left only one functioning steering mechanism. No backups. Mission rules were clear. You don't land on the moon unless you have both primary and backup systems working. But now the SPS, which would be needed for key return burns and even rescue scenarios, was unreliable. Young and Duke were already in the lunar module, hovering just 150 meters from Mattingly, waiting for a decision. Mission Control scrambled. Engineers at Rockwell in California worked around the clock while fuel continued to burn. The oxidizer levels dropped dangerously from all the maneuvers. Every second burned more helium too, leaking from the same regulator that failed days earlier. They were running out of time and running low on options. Even the science experiments weren't spared. The far ultraviolet camera, built by Dr. George Carruthers, was a first-of-its-kind device meant to capture ultraviolet images from the lunar surface, data that couldn't be gathered from Earth. Weighing 22 kilograms, the telescope was placed in Orion's shadow to avoid sunlight. But during key observations of nebulae and Earth's outer atmosphere, the device jammed. It simply stopped moving. The cesium iodide-coated film system froze. Duke, in his bulky pressure suit, had to crawl over and attempt field repairs using makeshift tools. It was a delicate camera, not meant for brute force handling. The geocorona, the faint outer glow of Earth in UV, was slipping away. The chance to study hydrogen sources in deep space from a moon-based observatory was nearly lost. Despite Duke's best efforts, the camera remained partially broken. Some data was saved, but much of it wasn't. Carruthers' revolutionary experiment limped through the rest of the mission, nowhere near full power. Food became another crisis. After heart problems on Apollo 15, NASA had boosted potassium levels in the drinks, especially the orange juice. The result was horrific. The new formula was thick, metallic, and overloaded with potassium. It wrecked the astronauts' stomachs. Gene Kranz, the no-nonsense flight director, tasted it himself and admitted it was awful. Young, Duke, and Mattingly all suffered. Constant gas, nausea, bloating. It became a mission-long misery. On the moon, while broadcasting live, Young accidentally left his microphone open and groaned, "I got the farts again, Charlie. I don't know what gives them to me. I really don't. I think it's acid in the stomach." The whole world heard it. The issue got worse when some of the food pouches leaked. Orange juice squirted inside Duke's suit, running down into his helmet during a moonwalk. The crew ended up eating almost everything on board, except the spoiled, wet meals. They stayed hungry, queasy, and deeply frustrated. And just before all of that unfolded, there had already been another disaster waiting to happen. Right after the trans-lunar injection burn, 4,200 miles from Earth, and speeding away at 10.8 kilometers per second, Mattingly separated the command module Casper from the SIVB to retrieve the lunar module Orion. Duke filmed what looked like a cloud of stars. Turns out they were flakes of thermal paint peeling off the LM. These flakes flooded the docking site, making navigation much harder. Mattingly managed soft contact with the docking probe, but then something failed. The mechanical latches refused to engage. The spacecraft just wouldn't lock. What should have taken minutes turned into 20 tense minutes of manual override. It echoed the Apollo 14 nightmare when the probe had failed multiple times. If they couldn't dock properly, They couldn't retrieve the LM. The mission would have to be aborted. Every second that passed drained precious maneuvering fuel, and every failed latch raised the stakes. Finally, the hard dock locked. On April 20th, 1972, something nearly went terribly wrong. The lunar module Orion was supposed to land smoothly in the Descartes Highlands, but hours before the descent, a strange vibration in the service propulsion system sent shockwaves through mission control. For nearly 6 hours, engineers scrambled, trying to figure out if the mission could continue or if it needed to be aborted entirely. The guidance computer was thrown off. Commander John Young had to take manual control. As the module dropped towards the moon, its descent slowed to just 2 feet per second. They had only about 100 seconds of fuel left, but against all odds, Orion touched down, just 270 meters off target, and the disaster everyone feared never came. It was razor thin. One mistake, and Apollo 16 would have been the first failed lunar landing. The next day, during their first moonwalk, a piece of the rover's rear fender tore clean off. The moon's dust is like powder, but when that exposed wheel spun, it kicked up a storm. The regolith sprayed into the air in giant arcs, landing on Charles Duke's suit and visor. He could barely see, and at one point, almost drove the rover into a crater. Dust stuck to everything. It wasn't just a nuisance. It was dangerous. It caused overheating in the rover and even forced the crew to cobble together a fix using duct tape and maps. But the dust had already made its mark. For the rest of the mission, it haunted them, working its way into seals, tools, and electronics. Later that same day, they tried to deploy a set of scientific instruments. This should have been straightforward, but the land was rough, uneven, filled with small craters. When Duke tried to hammer stakes into the ground, tools bent and broke. It took 45 extra minutes just to get the seismometers working. Then came the real blow. Duke accidentally stepped on a cable, snapping the connection to the heat flow experiment. It couldn't be fixed. Years of planning ruined in a single misstep. The central station still worked, but a major science goal was lost right there in the lunar dirt. A few days later, something very different happened. During their third and final moonwalk near Flag Crater, Duke pulled out a small plastic-wrapped photo of his family. He placed it gently on the surface. The image showed his wife Dottie and their sons, taken years earlier. He took a photo of the moment, then began writing on the back. Inside his helmet, his voice began to break. He was crying. That's dangerous in a suit like that. You can't wipe your eyes, can't blow your nose. But the emotion hit hard. He was leaving behind a piece of his family, 240,000 miles away from Earth, in a place that felt endlessly quiet. For a moment, everything he had trained for melted into something deeply human. The next day, they found something incredible. Near Plum Crater, they came across a rock unlike any other. It weighed 11.7 kilograms and would become the largest moon rock ever brought back to Earth. They named it Big Muley. But back in the module, preparing to leave, a warning light began flashing. The batteries were overheating. Lunar dust had somehow gotten into the cooling system. If they didn't fix it fast, they might not be able to power the systems needed to get home. Duke had to purge circuits manually, right there on the surface. The battery had hit 47 degrees Celsius, beyond its safety limits. They managed to hold it together, barely. When they finally left the moon and began re-entry on April 27th, a new problem hit. At 24,063 miles per hour, the capsule's thrusters, needed for control during descent, began misfiring. Cryogenic fuel lines had frozen. The guidance system failed. Ken Mattingly had to take over manually, using stars to correct their path while being crushed by 7 times the force of gravity. The landing missed its target by 3.4 miles. That doesn't sound like much, but for a spacecraft tumbling through atmosphere, it was a sign of how close things had come to breaking apart. Back on Earth, in Houston, another kind of scare unfolded. Inside the quarantine labs where moon rocks were being examined, scientists noticed something disturbing: bacteria that didn't seem to come from Earth. Some believed, just for a moment, that they had found life from another world. Emergency protocols were triggered. Duke's isolation was extended by 72 hours. But what truly alarmed everyone was that cockroaches were seen crawling in and out of the sealed lab. Eventually, the bacteria turned out to be Earth-based contamination, but the breach showed how unprepared NASA had been to protect the planet from possible alien pathogens. After the mission, Duke didn't slow down. He was promoted to colonel and sent to Edwards Air Force Base to oversee F-15 test flights. These were no ordinary drills. One day in 1974, during a high-speed refueling exercise, the boom from a tanker broke loose and nearly tore the wing off a prototype jet. Had it made contact, both aircraft would have exploded at 30,000 feet. Duke's team kept pushing the F-15 to its limits. Live missiles, extreme maneuvers, sudden structural failures. They had to borrow tanker planes from across the country just to keep up with the intense testing pace. But in 1976, he walked away. Duke left NASA on January 3rd, hoping for a fresh start in the beer industry. He teamed up with a former Olympic athlete and aimed to run a Coors distributorship. But instead of Austin, he was given the San Antonio region. The timing couldn't have been worse. The industry was collapsing into monopolies. Sales tanked. His business nearly failed, and he was falling apart. The excitement of the moon was gone. His marriage to Dottie was in shambles. She was battling depression and had begun to question whether life was even worth continuing. Then, something unexpected happened. Dottie went to a weekend event at church. It wasn't planned. She was just fulfilling a duty. But something changed in her. She found a spark of faith. She came home different. That change saved their marriage, and it pulled Duke out of his own darkness. He later said that walking on the moon didn't give him peace. Neither did money. But this was different. By the early 1980s, they had started a new journey. Duke Ministry for Christ was born. Charles and Dottie traveled the world. They spoke to millions. He brought lunar tools and photos to his talks. But it wasn't the moon story that stuck with people. It was how he said it left him empty. They preached in Africa, Europe, Asia. Some came for the astronaut. They stayed for the message. Even in his later years, Duke stayed active. At 90, he was still debunking moon landing hoaxes. He said that if it were fake, the world would have exposed it instantly. 400,000 people worked on Apollo. Secrecy would have been impossible. He mentored young astronauts training for NASA's Artemis program. He flew with them over difficult terrain, teaching them the psychology of landing. He helped build training that worked more like helicopters than planes, because landing on the moon is like nothing else. After 2010, his health started to falter. At 80, he had a heart procedure that forced him to cancel events. Thousands were left waiting across Europe, but he bounced back. He continued mentoring, preaching, and speaking. He helped raise over $5 million in scholarships for STEM students. He advised museums, helped design exhibits, and stayed in the public eye. He was honored again and again. But what mattered most was that he never let go of that moment in 1978 when faith saved his family.